Chicago during February doesn't just blow, it carves. It finds the gaps in your buttons, the thinness of your socks, and the vulnerabilities in your soul. Michael Dawson felt every bit of it as he stepped out of the diner on South Market Street. His boots, heavy with the grime of a 12-hour shift at the Henley Street construction site, crunched against the blackened slush of the sidewalk. In his right hand, he clutched a styrofoam container. It was warm, precious warmth. Inside was a pork chop, a mountain of mashed potatoes drowning in thick, peppery gravy, and a buttered roll. It was the only meal he would have today. He had counted out the exact change for it 47 minutes after he had sliced his thumb open on a jagged steel bracket at work. He hadn't told the foreman. Telling someone meant a trip to the clinic, paperwork, and the loss of a half-day's pay. Michael couldn't afford to lose a single cent. He was halfway to the bus stop when he saw her. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded rags huddled against the brick wall of the old market. But then, the rags moved. A small rhythmic shivering caught his eye. He stopped. He shouldn't have stopped. Every second he spent standing still was a second the wind had to freeze the sweat on his back. But something about the shape was wrong. He walked closer, and his heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was sitting directly on the ice-covered concrete. Her coat was so thin it was practically translucent, a faded pink garment that might have been worn 3 winters ago, but was now just a memory of fabric. Her hair, a tangled nest of dark curls, was matted with frozen sleet. But it was the crutch that broke him. Leaning against the wall beside her was a rusted, oversized metal crutch. It was built for an adult, but it had been crudely cut down, the edges jagged and raw. Her right leg was tucked at an angle that made Michael's own joints ache just looking at it. Twisted, wrong from birth, useless against the cold. She held a bent tin cup in her lap. It was empty, not a single penny, not a single scrap of food. Michael looked at the crowded street. People were rushing past, their heads tucked into scarves, their eyes fixed on the middle distance. They weren't just ignoring her, they were practicing the athletic art of not seeing. To see her was to be responsible for her, and in this city, in this cold, no one wanted that weight. Michael looked down at his warm styrofoam container. He thought about his empty apartment. He thought about the kitchen sink he usually stood over to eat his lonely meals. Then he looked at the girl's cheeks, hollow, gray-white, and deathly still. He walked over and crouched down. His knees popped, a sharp sound in the freezing air. He didn't stand over her. He knew what it was like to have a large man loom over you when you were small and afraid. He brought himself down to her level. "Hey," he said. His voice was gravelly, unused to kindness. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at first. It was as if she had already accepted that the world was made of ice and silence. "I've got more than I can eat," Michael lied. The lie felt like a heavy stone in his throat, but he pushed it out. "I'm looking for someone to help me finish this. You interested?" Slowly, the girl's head lifted. Her eyes were enormous, dark brown, nearly black, and filled with a weary wisdom that no 5-year-old should possess. She looked at the container, then at him. She didn't reach for it. She didn't beg. "I don't have any money," she whispered. Her voice was so thin the wind nearly carried it away. "I didn't ask for money," Michael said. He popped the lid. The steam rose up, a fragrant cloud of salt and fat. "I asked for help. This thing is heavy." He set the plate on her lap. Her hands, tiny and blue-tinted, gripped the edges of the styrofoam. She touched the bread roll first. She didn't wolf it down. She bit off a tiny piece and chewed it with a slow, methodical focus, as if she were trying to remember how to swallow. "What's your name?" Michael asked quietly. "Emily?" She breathed between bites. "Emily. That's a strong name. Where's your mama, Emily?" The girl stopped chewing. She looked toward the far end of the market, toward the dark shadows beneath the railway bridge. "There was a big snow," she said, her voice flat, as if she were reading a weather report. "She went to find something. She told me to wait. I waited 2 days under the bridge. Then I came here. How long have you been out here, Emily? In the market?" She looked back at the bread. 4 days. The number hit Michael like a physical blow. 4 days. In this temperature, 4 days was a death sentence. He looked at her bare right hand. She only had one glove, a mismatched wool thing on her left. Her right fingers were gray. "Sir!" A sharp, clipped voice interrupted them. Michael looked up. A woman in a long wool coat, carrying expensive shopping bags, was standing a few feet away. Her face was twisted in a mask of concerned disapproval. "That child has been there since morning," the woman said. "Someone has already called the authorities. You shouldn't be bothering her. It doesn't look right. A man like you crouching there." Michael felt a surge of cold, hard anger. "You're right," he said, standing up slowly, his height suddenly intimidating. "It doesn't look right. It doesn't look right that she's been here for 4 days, and the only thing anyone gave her was a phone call to get her removed. I'm giving her my dinner. That's all that's happening here." The woman huffed, her face reddening, and scurried away. Michael turned back to Emily. She was watching him, her eyes wide. She looked like she expected him to leave now, to follow the woman, to disappear like everyone else. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily," Michael said, and for the first time in 4 years, since the accident, since the funeral, since his life had become a series of empty rooms, he felt a spark of purpose. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm. Do you trust me?" Emily looked at the empty styrofoam plate, then at the man with the scarred hands and the tired eyes. She reached for her rusted crutch. "You waited," she said simply. "Nobody else waits." The wind didn't just howl anymore. It shrieked like a wounded animal. Michael Dawson adjusted his grip on Emily. She was lighter than a bundle of firewood, her bones feeling fragile against his chest. He had tucked her inside his heavy duster coat, buttoning the top toggle so only her small, pale face peeked out near his collar. Every step Michael took was a battle. The snow had reached his shins, and underneath the white powder was a treacherous layer of black ice. One slip would mean both of them crashing down, and he knew Emily didn't have the strength to survive a fall. "Stay awake, Emily," Michael muttered, his breath coming out in thick white plumes. "Look at the lights. See that blue one over there? Tell me what it looks like." "It looks like a star that fell down," she whispered. Her voice was getting weaker. That was the danger. In this kind of cold, sleep was the enemy. If she drifted off now, her heart might decide it was too tired to keep beating. As they turned the corner away from the market, the streetlights grew sparse. This was the gray zone, a part of the city where the law didn't like to walk, and the shadows stayed long even at noon. Michael felt a familiar prickle at the back of his neck. He wasn't just a construction worker. He had a past, a history of debts, and men who didn't forget a face. He had spent years trying to be invisible, but carrying a child through a blizzard under the glow of a flickering neon sign made him a target. Two figures emerged from the mouth of an alleyway. They were dressed in heavy, grease-stained parkas, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't look like people seeking shelter. They looked like hunters. "Hey, friend," one of them called out. His voice was raspy, the sound of a man who smoked too much and cared too little. "That's a heavy load you're carrying. You look like you could use some help. Or maybe you've got something in that coat worth sharing." Michael didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. "Keep walking," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a low, dangerous growl. The two men stepped out into his path. The taller one held a rusted iron pipe. "We saw you at the market, saw you giving away food. If you've got enough to feed the street rats, you've got enough to pay the toll for this street." Michael stopped. He looked down at Emily. She had squeezed her eyes shut, her tiny hands clutching his shirt through his layers. The anger that had been simmering in Michael since he first saw her sitting in the snow finally reached a boiling point. It wasn't just anger at these men. It was anger at a world that let a 5-year-old starve while others fought over scraps. "Listen to me very carefully," Michael said, stepping forward. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't have to. The sheer mass of him, combined with the look of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, made the taller man flinch. "I am carrying a dying child. If you stand in my way for one more second, I will forget that I am trying to be a better man. Do you understand?" The air between them turned electric. For a moment, the only sound was the whistling wind. Then, the man with the pipe lowered it. He saw the crutch tucked under Michael's arm. He saw the tiny, frostbitten hand of the girl. "Crazy bastard," the man muttered, stepping aside. "She's gonna freeze anyway. Why bother?" "Because I can," Michael snapped, and he pushed past them, his boots thudding rhythmically against the frozen earth. He knew of a place, a basement clinic run by an old doctor named Elias who didn't ask for ID or insurance. It was 6 blocks away. In a blizzard, 6 blocks might as well be 6 miles. Michael's thumb, the one he had sliced open at the site, began to throb with a rhythmic pulsing heat. The cold was moving into his joints, making his movements stiff. He started to hum a low, tuneless song, something his mother used to sing, just to keep his own mind focused. "Michael?" Emily's voice was a ghost of a sound. "I'm here, kiddo. We're almost there. My legs, they don't hurt anymore. That was the worst sign. When the pain stops, the frostbite is winning." "I know," Michael lied, his heart breaking. "That's because the magic is working. The warmth is coming. You just have to keep your eyes open for me. Can you do that? Can you count the doors we pass? 1, 2. She started, her voice trailing off. Michael began to run. It was a clumsy, heavy-footed jog, but he pushed his lungs until they burned. He reached the green door at the end of the alley. He kicked it with his boot, a loud, desperate thud. "Elias, open up! It's Dawson!" Silence. The wind mocked him. He kicked again. "Elias, I have a child! Open the damn door!" Finally, the sound of heavy bolts sliding back. The door creaked open, revealing a sliver of yellow light and the smell of antiseptic and old paper. A man with spectacles perched on his forehead looked out. "Dawson, what have you done now? I told you not to come back unless—" "Shut up and move," Michael said, pushing his way inside. He immediately unbuttoned his coat. "She's freezing. She hasn't eaten in days. Her leg is bad." Elias looked at the bundle in Michael's arms, and his professional irritation vanished instantly. "Get her to the back table, now! Get the blankets from the heater." The air inside Dr. Elias's basement was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol, old leather-bound books, and the metallic tang of a kerosene heater. It was a sharp contrast to the biting, sterile cold of the Chicago streets. Michael didn't wait for an invitation. He strode to the back of the room, past rows of glass jars filled with tinctures, and laid Emily down on the wooden examination table. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying lightness of her body. As he pulled his heavy duster coat away, the true extent of Emily's condition became visible under the harsh hiss of the gas lamps. "God in heaven," Elias whispered, pushing his spectacles down onto the bridge of his nose. He moved with a speed that defied his age. "Dawson, get those wet rags off her. Carefully. We need to check for skin crystallization." Michael's scarred fingers fumbled with the thin, soaked fabric of Emily's dress. Every time he touched her, he felt like he might break her. Her skin was a translucent marble blue. When he finally removed the mismatched wool glove, her right hand remained in a claw-like shape, frozen in the position of holding that tin cup. Is she going to lose the hand? Michael's voice was a jagged edge. "Don't think about that yet," Elias snapped, grabbing a stack of blankets that had been draped over the heater. "Think about her heart. If we warm her too fast, the cold blood from her limbs will rush to her core and stop her heart. It's called after drop. We have to be surgical." Michael watched as the doctor began to wrap her torso first, leaving her limbs exposed for the moment. Emily's eyes were half open, but they weren't focusing. She was looking at something far beyond the ceiling of the basement, leaving her limbs exposed for the moment. Emily's eyes were half open, but they weren't focusing. She was looking at something far beyond the ceiling of the basement. "Emily, stay with me, kid." Michael leaned in, his shadow looming large over the table. "You remember the potatoes? The gravy? We're going to get more, a whole mountain of them, but you have to stay awake to eat them." A tiny, shiver-racked sob escaped her lips. It was the most beautiful sound Michael had ever heard. It meant she was still in there. As Elias worked, he glanced at Michael. "You're bleeding, Michael. Your hand." Michael looked down at his thumb. The cold had numbed the pain, but now, in the warmth, the wound had reopened. A slow, steady drip of crimson was staining the floorboards. "It's nothing. Just a souvenir from the site." "It's not nothing. You're pale as a ghost. Sit down before you become my second patient." "I'm fine," Michael growled, but his legs betrayed him. He sank onto a wooden stool, his eyes never leaving Emily. "Where did you find her?" Elias asked, his voice softening as he began to rub Emily's feet with a dry cloth, trying to stimulate circulation without damaging the tissue. The market. She'd been there 4 days. 4 days, Elias. Thousands of people walked past her. They looked at her crutch. They looked at her rags, and they kept walking like she was a piece of trash caught in the wind. Elias sighed, a sound of profound weariness. This city has a way of turning hearts into flint, Michael. You know that better than anyone. You spent 3 years trying to turn your own heart into stone. Michael didn't respond. He reached out and tentatively touched a strand of Emily's hair. It was drying now, turning from a matted black to a soft chestnut brown. She told me her mother went to find something under the bridge and never came back. She waited 2 days in the snow before she moved to the market. She's a fighter, Elias. She's got more grit in her pinky finger than most men I know. Just as Emily's breathing began to steady, a rhythmic, heavy pounding echoed from the street-level door. It wasn't the desperate kick of a man in need. It was the measured, authoritative strike of someone who owned the street. Michael froze. He knew that rhythm. "Elias, stay with her," Michael whispered, rising from the stool. His hand instinctively went to the small of his back, reaching for a weight that wasn't there anymore. The weight of a revolver he had sold months ago to pay for his apartment. "Who is it?" Elias asked, his eyes wide with alarm. "The past," Michael replied. He walked to the front of the clinic, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He pulled a small iron grate open on the door to look out. Through the swirling snow stood a man in a charcoal overcoat. Flanked by 2 bruisers, Michael recognized from the docks. It was Silas Vane, the man Michael owed for a life he had tried to leave behind. "I know you're in there, Dawson." Vane's voice carried through the wood, smooth and cold as a razor blade. "I heard you were playing the Good Samaritan at the market. That's a very expensive hobby for a man who hasn't paid his interests." Michael leaned his forehead against the door. He looked back at the table where the tiny girl lay fighting for her life. He had a choice. He could run out the back and lead them away, or he could stay and risk them coming inside. "Elias," Michael called out softly without turning around. "Lock the back room. Don't come out until I tell you." The wood of the door was freezing, but the blood in Michael's veins was boiling. He could hear Silas Vane's rhythmic tapping on the glass, a sound that reminded him of a coffin nail being driven home. Michael looked back one last time. Through the cracked doorway of the back room, he saw the flickering orange light of the heater dancing on Emily's sleeping face. She looked like an angel carved from ice, slowly melting back into the world of the living. He couldn't let the cold in. Not the blizzard, and certainly not Silas Vane. Michael unbolted the door and stepped out into the vestibule, closing the heavy oak barrier behind him so Vane couldn't see the girl. The wind screamed into the hallway, bringing a spray of crystals that stung Michael's face. Silas Vane was a man of sharp angles and expensive tastes. His charcoal coat was made of the finest wool, and his leather gloves were soft enough to feel a heartbeat through. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Eyes that were the color of a frozen lake. "Dawson," Vane purred, his voice barely audible over the gale. "You look terrible. Honest work clearly doesn't suit you. That construction site is turning your hands into sandpaper and your brain into mush. What do you want, Silas? Michael's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He stood with his legs apart, anchoring himself like an oak tree against the wind. "I want what's mine," Vane said, stepping closer. The two bruisers behind him shifted their weight, their hands disappearing into their pockets. "You disappeared 6 months ago. You walked away from the crew. You walked away from the collection business. And you walked away with $4,000 of my venture capital. That money paid for the burials of the men you killed in the dock fire." Michael spat. "I didn't keep a cent of it. You know that." "I don't care about burials, Michael. I care about ledgers. And your page is written in very deep red ink." Vane tilted his head, looking past Michael's shoulder at the door. "But I'm a reasonable man. I heard the chatter in the streets. They say Michael, the Hammer, Dawson, the man who used to break kneecaps for a living, was seen crying over a beggar child in the snow. It's a touching story. It makes you look weak. And weak men are easy to negotiate with." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "She has nothing to do with this. She's just a kid." "She's leverage, Michael," Vane hissed, the mask of politeness finally slipping. "Elias is in there, isn't he? Patching her up. I wonder how much the city would pay to know that a disgraced outlaw and an unlicensed doctor are harboring a stolen child." Michael's fist clenched. He could take the two bruisers, but Vane was fast and he was armed. More importantly, any fight here would spill into the back room. Emily's lungs were too weak to handle the smoke of a gunshot or the trauma of a brawl. "Leave the girl out of it," Michael said, his voice trembling with a restrained violence. "I'll come back. I'll go back to work for you. One last job, whatever you need. Just walk away from this door right now." Vane's eyes lit up. This was the prize he wanted. Not the money, but Michael's muscle. Michael was a legend in the underworld, a man who could move through the shadows like a ghost and fight like a demon. "One job?" Vane smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "No, Michael. You work until I say the debt is settled. You start tomorrow at dawn. I'll have a carriage waiting at your apartment." "Fine," Michael said, the word tasting like ash. "Now get off this property." Vane tipped his hat, a mocking gesture of respect. "See you at sunrise, Hammer. Don't be late. It would be a shame if I had to send the boys back here to check on your charity project." As the shadows of the three men disappeared into the white curtain of the blizzard, Michael leaned his head against the door and let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a lifetime. He had saved Emily's life, but he had just sold his soul back to the devil to do it. He walked back into the warm room. Elias was sitting by the table, holding a spoonful of broth to Emily's lips. She was awake now, her eyes clear but tired. When she saw Michael, a tiny, genuine smile broke across her face, the first light in the darkness. "Michael?" she whispered. "Is the bad wind gone?" Michael sat on the edge of the table and took her small, warming hand in his. He looked at his own scarred, blood-stained knuckles, the tools of a man who was about to go back to a life of sin so that she could have a life of hope. "Yeah, Emily," Michael said, his voice breaking. "The wind is gone. You're safe now, I promise." Between midnight and dawn are the longest in a man's life when he knows his freedom has an expiration date. Michael sat in the corner of the clinic, his back against the cold stone wall, watching the steady rise and fall of Emily's chest. Every breath she took was a victory, but every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway was a reminder of the sun that would soon rise, a sun that would see him return to the chains he thought he had broken. Elias walked over, 2 tin mugs of coffee in his hands. The steam carried the bitter, earthy scent of chicory. He handed one to Michael without a word. Elias walked over, 2 tin mugs of coffee in his hands. The steam carried the bitter, earthy scent of chicory. He handed one to Michael without a word. "You shouldn't have done it, Michael," Elias said softly, his voice heavy with the wisdom of a man who had seen too many good men throw themselves into the fire. "Vane is a snake. You give a snake a finger, and he'll take the whole arm. Then, the heart." Michael took a sip of the scalding liquid. He was going to come inside Elias. He was going to take her. Or worse, he'd have called the wardens. They'd have put her in the O'Connell orphanage. You know what happens to girls with a limp in that place. They don't get fed. They get forgotten. As the sky began to turn a bruised, sickly purple, Michael stood up. His body felt like it was made of rusted iron. He walked to the table. Emily was stirring, her small hand reaching out in her sleep, as if searching for something to hold on to. He knelt by the bed. "Emily, I have to go to work for a little while." Her eyes fluttered open. The fear was there instantly, the fear of a child who had already been abandoned once in the snow. "You're leaving?" "Only for a bit," Michael said, his voice cracking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden bird, a trinket he had spent weeks whittling during his lunch breaks at the construction site. He placed it in her palm. "You hold on to this. As long as you have this bird, it means I'm on my way back to you. Dr. Elias is going to keep you warm. He's got more books in here than a library. You can look at the pictures, okay?" Emily gripped the wooden bird tightly. "Promise?" "I promise on my soul," Michael whispered. He kissed her forehead. Her skin was finally warm, the marble blue replaced by a healthy, faint pink. Michael stepped out of the clinic just as a black carriage pulled up, its wheels creaking against the fresh ice. The driver was a man named Stitches, a silent brute with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. He didn't say a word. He just jerked his head toward the door. Inside the carriage, the air smelled of expensive tobacco and old blood. Silas Vane was sitting across from him, reading a newspaper by the light of a small oil lamp. "You're on time," Vane said without looking up. "I like that. It shows you still have some of that military discipline left in you." "Where are we going?" Vane folded the paper slowly. "There is a shipment coming in at the North Docks. It's not ours, but by the time the sun hits the meridian, it will be. The men guarding it are stubborn. They need someone with a reputation. They need the hammer." Michael looked out the window. The city was waking up, a gray industrial beast coughing smoke into the freezing sky. He saw the working men trudging to the factories, their heads down, their lives a cycle of toil. He had tried to be one of them. He had tried to be honest, but the world had a way of pulling men like him back into the mud. "I don't kill unless I have to," Michael said, his voice flat. "You'll do what is necessary to protect your charity project, Michael," Vane replied, a cruel glint in his eye. "Don't forget who owns her safety right now." The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, heading toward the dark, skeletal cranes of the docks. Michael felt the weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders, heavier than the snow, colder than the wind. He was an outlaw again. The North Docks were a skeletal forest of iron and timber. Huge steam-powered cranes loomed over the black water of the lake like prehistoric beasts, their chains clanking rhythmically in the freezing gale. Here, the snow didn't stay white. It turned a sickly charcoal gray as it mixed with the soot from the nearby steel mills. The carriage groaned to a halt near Warehouse 14. Michael stepped out, the salt-heavy air hitting his lungs like a physical blow. Behind him, Vane's bruisers, two men named Cale and Miller, stepped out, checking the cylinders of their revolvers with a chilling nonchalance. "The shipment is inside," Vane said, leaning out of the carriage window. He didn't step out. A man like Vane didn't get his boots dirty until the blood was already dry. 6 guards, Pinkerton hires. They're professional, but they aren't the Hammer. Go in, clear the floor, and signal the wagons. Do this, Michael, and Emily stays warm for another week. Michael didn't look back. He walked toward the massive sliding doors of the warehouse. Every step felt like he was walking into a grave he had dug for himself months ago. He reached into the hidden pocket of his duster and pulled out a heavy iron pipe, a makeshift weapon that felt familiar and hateful in his hand. He didn't use the front entrance. He knew the architecture of these buildings from his time on the construction crews. He climbed a rusted fire escape, his boots silent on the metal, and slipped through a high, clear-story window. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of crates and shadows. The air was thick with the smell of raw wool, unrefined sugar, and gunpowder. Below him, 4 guards walked in a diamond formation around a series of reinforced steel trunks. 2 more sat in an elevated office, their rifles resting against the glass. Michael crouched on the catwalk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He closed his eyes for a second. He didn't see the warehouse. He saw the wooden bird in Emily's hand. He felt the warmth of her forehead. "I am doing this so she doesn't have to," he told himself. "I am the monster, so she can be the human." He moved like smoke. He dropped from the catwalk onto the roof of the office, the sound muffled by the roar of a nearby steam vent. Before the guards inside could turn, Michael was through the door. He didn't use a gun. A gun was too loud, too final. He used the weight of his body and the iron pipe. Within seconds, the 2 guards were down, unconscious, but breathing. Michael took their rifles and tossed them into a bin of loose cotton. Then, he turned his attention to the floor. One of the guards below noticed the lack of movement in the office. "Hey, Miller, you awake up there?" Michael stepped out onto the balcony of the office. The light from a hanging gas lamp hit his face, carving deep shadows into his rugged features. The guards froze. They recognized the silhouette. They recognized the way he stood, shoulders broad, head tilted, a man who had survived 100 fights and walked away from all of them. "It's Dawson," one of the guards whispered, his voice cracking. "The Hammer is back." "Drop the keys," Michael said, his voice echoing through the vast space like a tolling bell. "Walk out the back gate. Tell Vane you were overwhelmed. If you stay, I can't promise you'll see the sun." The guards looked at each other. They were paid well, but they weren't paid enough to die at the hands of a legend. Slowly, the lead guard unhooked a heavy brass ring of keys from his belt and let them fall. The clang echoed through the warehouse. As the guards retreated into the snowy night, Michael walked down the stairs. He felt a profound sense of sickness in his stomach. He had won, but he had also proved Vane right. Michael was still the man he used to be. He walked to the large warehouse doors and swung them open. The blizzard rushed in, coating the crates in a thin layer of white. He raised a lantern and swung it in 3 wide arcs, the signal for Vane's wagons to move in. Within minutes, the silence was replaced by the shouting of men and the cracking of whips. Vane's crew swarmed the building like locusts. Silas Vane himself stepped through the doors, a silk handkerchief pressed to his nose to ward off the smell of the docks. "Magnificent," Vane said, looking at the unconscious guards in the office. "No blood on the floor, no police on the way. You still have the touch, Michael." "We're done," Michael said, walking toward the exit. "I did the job. Now give me the coins for Emily's medicine." Vane reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy leather pouch at Michael's feet. "For the medicine, yes, but the debt is barely scratched, Michael. We have a train to meet on Tuesday. Don't be late." Michael gripped the pouch of coins so hard, his knuckles turned white. He didn't say a word. He walked out into the storm, heading back toward the basement where a little girl was waiting for a wooden bird to bring him home. The walk back from the docks felt longer than the walk to them. The leather pouch of coins clinked rhythmically against Michael's thigh, a sound of gold that felt like lead. He didn't go straight to the clinic. A man like Vane always had tailmen, shadows that followed the muscle to see where they slept and who they loved. Michael ducked into a 24-hour blacksmith shop, the roar of the forge and the rhythmic clang-clang of the hammer masking his movements. He emerged from the back alley, having looped through 3 different tenements, shed his blood-stained duster for a common worker's coat, and doubled back toward the clinic through a forgotten coal chute. When he finally entered the basement, the warmth hit him like a physical embrace. Emily was sitting up, leaning against a pile of pillows. She was clutching the wooden bird so tightly that her knuckles were white. Elias was at his desk, cleaning a set of surgical tools. He looked up as Michael entered. He didn't ask how the job went. The exhaustion in Michael's eyes told him everything. "The coins," Michael said, dropping the heavy pouch onto the desk. "Buy the best medicine. Buy the cod liver oil, the wool blankets, and enough coal to keep this place like a furnace for a month." "Michael, this is enough to buy a small house," Elias said, peering into the bag. "Vane didn't give this out of the goodness of his heart. He gave it because he thinks he bought my hands," Michael replied, kneeling by Emily's bed. "But he's wrong. He only rented them for a night. Look what I got," Emily whispered, showing him the wooden bird. He flew all the way to the window. Michael smiled, a rare and fragile thing. "He's a brave bird, like you." He took a small folded piece of paper from his pocket, a map he had drawn from memory of the city's underground tunnels and the train schedules. He tucked it behind a loose brick near her bed. "Emily, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. "Dr. Elias is going to teach you a game. It's called The Invisible Girl. If anyone ever comes to that door and they don't say the secret word, you go to the back cupboard and stay quiet until the sun goes down. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her eyes wide with the gravity of his tone. "What's the secret word?" "Montana," Michael said. It was the place he had always dreamed of taking his own family before the fire. A place of open skies and no shadows. If you hear that word, you know it's me or someone I sent. As the day progressed, the reality of Michael's situation grew grimmer. He spent the afternoon cleaning his old tools, preparing for the Tuesday train job Vane had mentioned. Every hour he spent in the clinic was a risk. He knew that by protecting Emily, he was making her a target. He pulled Elias aside near the coal bin. "I need a favor, Elias, one that goes beyond medicine. There's a convent 3 towns over, St. Jude's. They take in children. They don't ask names, and they don't let strangers in. I need you to find a way to get her there if I don't come back on Tuesday night." Elias paused, a scalpel mid-air. "You're talking like a man who's planning his own funeral, Michael." "I'm talking like a man who knows Silas Vane. He won't let me walk away twice. The only way Emily is safe is if she's somewhere even I can't find her." Suddenly, a faint scratching came from the street-level window. Michael froze. He reached for the heavy iron fire poker. He crept toward the window and looked up. A young boy, no more than 12, was standing in the snow, holding a crumpled note against the glass. Michael opened the small vent. "Speak." "Mr. Vane says the schedule changed," the boy chirped, his voice trembling in the cold. "The train isn't Tuesday. It's tonight. You have 1 hour. The carriage is at the corner of 5th. The boy vanished into the fog. Michael felt the floor drop out from under him. Vane was testing him, moving the goalpost to see if he was truly ready to jump. He looked back at Emily. She was tracing the wings of the wooden bird with her thumb. He didn't have time to say a proper goodbye. He couldn't risk the emotion breaking his resolve. "Elias," Michael said, grabbing his worn-out leather gloves. "Remember the word, Montana." The world was a blur of black iron and blinding white sleet. The carriage ride to the 5th Street corner had been silent, a funeral procession before the first body had even fallen. Michael sat with his hands buried in his pockets, his fingers tracing the rough edges of the iron pipe he still carried. Across from him, the bruiser named Cale was sharpening a folding knife, the shink-shink of the steel against stone, a rhythmic countdown to the chaos. "Vane says you're the best at quiet entries, Hammer," Cale said, his voice a jagged rasp. "But tonight isn't about quiet. Tonight is about sending a message. The cargo on the 1205 from Detroit isn't just gold. It's a ledger that names every man Vane has on his payroll. If that book reaches the governor's desk, we're all swinging from a rope by Friday." Michael didn't blink. He wasn't thinking about the ledger. He was thinking about a wooden bird and a secret word. The carriage stopped near the switching station at the edge of the city. The wind here was unrestricted, whipping across the flat, open tracks with a ferocity that made it hard to breathe. In the distance, the single cyclopean eye of the locomotive's headlight cut through the snow, a brilliant beam of white light that turned the falling flakes into sparks of fire. "Move," Cale ordered. Michael stepped out. The rail yard was a graveyard of rusting cars and coal piles. He moved toward the water tower, his boots finding purchase on the ice-covered gravel. He was the vanguard. His job was to disable the guard in the signal tower so the train would be forced to slow down at the junction. He climbed the ladder of the signal tower, his muscles screaming. The metal was so cold, it felt like it was burning through his gloves. Inside, a young man was leaning over a telegraph machine, the rhythmic dot dash dot the only sound in the small cabin. Michael stepped into the light. The operator turned, his eyes widening. He reached for a whistle around his neck, but Michael was faster. He didn't use the pipe. He used the flat of his hand, a precise strike to the temple that sent the young man into a deep, dreamless sleep. Michael looked at the controls. He pulled the heavy iron lever. The tracks below groaned and shifted, the sound lost in the growing roar of the approaching engine. The train hit the junction and slowed, the steam brakes screaming like 1,000 tortured souls. As the engine hissed to a crawl, shadows emerged from the coal piles. Vane's men swarmed the mid-cars. Michael watched from the tower. He saw the flashes of gunfire, muted pops against the howling wind. He saw the guards on the train falling. This wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. "Dawson, get down here!" Cale's voice drifted up. Michael descended the ladder. He reached the train just as the doors to the safe car were being pried open with crowbars. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and cordite. "Where is it?" Vane's lead man, Miller, shouted, tossing bags of mail onto the tracks. Michael stepped into the safe car. It was silent inside. 2 guards lay slumped in the corner. In the center of the car was a small, reinforced black box. But something was wrong. There were no locks on the box, no seals. Michael opened it. The box was empty. There was no ledger. There was no gold. There was only a single typed piece of paper at the bottom. Michael picked it up. His heart stopped. A man who cares for a child is a man who can be predicted. While you were at the tracks, Michael, my men were at the clinic. The debt is settled. The bird has flown. The world went cold, colder than the blizzard, colder than the iron. Michael dropped the paper, and for a second, the legendary hammer was gone. There was only a man who had lost his soul for a lie. Cale stepped into the car, his eyes narrowing at the empty box. "Where's the book, Dawson? What's going on?" Michael turned. The look in his eyes made Cale take a step back. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had already died and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. He lied. Michael whispered, "What?" "Vane lied." Michael's voice erupted in a roar that drowned out the train engine. He lunged. He didn't use a weapon. He used his bare hands. He caught Cale by the throat and slammed him against the steel wall of the car. The bruiser reached for his knife, but Michael broke his wrist with a single, sickening twist. Where did he take her? Michael hissed, his face inches from Cale's. I don't know. Vane sent the other crew. They were supposed to take her to the warehouse at the docks. Michael dropped him like a sack of grain. He didn't look at the other men. He didn't care about the gunfire or the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. He leapt from the train car, hitting the snow at a dead run. He didn't head for the carriage. He headed for the shortcut, the frozen river. He had to get to the docks. He had to hear her say the word. The wind at the rail yards had been a slap, but the wind on the river was a blade. Michael Dawson didn't wait for the wagons or the chaos behind him to settle. He knew the streets would be crawling with Vane's men and the police. The only way to reach the North Docks in time was the one path no sane man would take: the frozen surface of the Chicago River. His boots thudded against the jagged ice. The river wasn't a smooth mirror. It was a chaotic landscape of heaving frozen plates and slush traps. Beneath his feet, he could hear the deep, rhythmic thrum of the dark water, a monster waiting for a single misstep. Every breath was a struggle. The cold air burned his throat like lye, and the sweat on his brow was turning into a mask of ice. But Michael didn't feel the cold. He felt the phantom weight of Emily in his arms. He saw the way her small fingers had gripped the wooden bird. Montana, he whispered to the wind. The word was his mantra. The only thing keeping his legs moving when his muscles screamed for him to collapse. He reached the midpoint of the river when a searchlight from the bridge above swept across the ice. The police were already sealing the city. The light brushed past him, a brilliant white eye. Michael dropped flat against the ice, his chest heaving. He stayed there for a heartbeat, the freezing slush soaking into his clothes until the light moved on. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a force of nature. He hauled himself up and kept running, his eyes fixed on the skeletal silhouettes of the North Dock cranes that rose through the fog like the ribs of a dead giant. He reached the wharf, climbing the icy pilings with bleeding fingers. Warehouse 14, the same place where he had done Vane's dirty work only hours before, stood silent and imposing. But this time, the doors weren't just shut. They were barred from the inside. Michael didn't go for the doors. He knew the layout. He went for the drainage pipe near the water level, a narrow, filth-choked tunnel that led into the subflooring. He crawled through the frozen sludge, his teeth gritted, until he reached a loose floorboard. He emerged into the darkness of the warehouse. It smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. And then he heard it, a sound that shattered his heart and rebuilt it into a weapon. A soft, rhythmic tapping, the sound of a metal crutch hitting a wooden floor. Michael moved through the stacks of crates like a predator. In the center of the warehouse, under a single hanging lamp, stood Silas Vane. He was holding Emily's wooden bird in his gloved hand, turning it over as if it were a curious insect. Emily was sitting on a crate nearby, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. Two of Vane's men stood behind her, their hands on her shoulders. "You're late, Michael," Vane said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He didn't even look up. "I expected you 10 minutes ago. The river must be slower this time of year." Michael stepped into the circle of light. He was covered in ice, mud, and blood. He looked less like a man and more like a vengeful spirit. "Let her go, Silas. You have the shipment. You have the city. You don't need a 5-year-old girl." "Oh, but I do." Vane smiled, finally looking up. His eyes were devoid of any humanity. "I don't need her for her life, Michael. I need her for yours. As long as I have her, the hammer does exactly what I say. You are the perfect weapon, and every weapon needs a sheath." Vane held the wooden bird over a small burning brazier. "Tell me, Michael, what is the word?" The girl won't speak. She just keeps looking at the door. "What is the word you told her?" Michael looked at Emily. For a split second, their eyes met. In that look, he didn't see a victim. He saw the grit he had admired back at the market. "She won't tell you," Michael said, his voice as cold as the river, "because she knows I'm here now." "Is that so?" Vane lowered the bird toward the flames. "Last chance, Dawson. Drop your guard, or the bird burns and the girl follows." Michael didn't drop his guard. He reached into his coat and pulled out the iron pipe. "The word," Michael growled, "is Montana." Emily's eyes lit up. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She bit the hand of the guard holding her and dove behind a stack of crates, just as Michael lunged. The word Montana hadn't just been a secret. It was a trigger. The moment it left Michael's lips, the air in the warehouse shattered. Emily, small and agile, vanished between the towering stacks of wool crates. Vane's men were momentarily frozen, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of a child who refused to be a victim. But Michael wasn't frozen. He was a hurricane. Michael didn't run. He collided. He threw the iron pipe with a precision born of a decade of violence. It caught the first guard, the one who had been holding Emily, square in the chest with a sickening thud. As the man went down, Michael was already on the second bruiser. He didn't use finesse. He used the raw, kinetic energy of his weight. He caught the man's arm, twisted it until the bone groaned, and slammed him face first into the iron brazier. Sparks erupted like miniature stars, lighting up the dark cavern of the warehouse in jagged bursts of orange and gold. "Kill him!" Vane screamed, dropping the wooden bird and scrambling back into the shadows. He reached into his fine wool coat and pulled out a nickel-plated revolver, his hands trembling with a rage that had finally replaced his cold calculation. Michael dived behind a heavy oak desk just as a bullet splintered the wood inches from his head. The smell of ozone and burnt timber filled his nostrils. "Emily, stay down!" Michael roared over the ring of gunfire. Michael knew he couldn't win a shootout. He was outgunned and exhausted, his body a map of bruises and frostbite. But he knew this warehouse. He knew the echoes. He knew where the floorboards creaked and where the shadows were deep enough to swallow a man whole. He kicked over a stack of oil lanterns, the glass shattering, and the kerosene spreading across the floor. He didn't light it. Not yet. He needed the darkness. "Dawson!" Vane's voice came from the far corner, high-pitched and frantic. "You think you're a hero? You're a killer. You're just like me. Look at your hands, Michael. They're stained with the same dirt as mine." Michael moved silently through the rafters, his boots finding the iron beams. He looked down. Vane was standing near the center, spinning in circles, his revolver aimed at every shadow that moved. "I know what I am, Silas." Michael's voice drifted down from the ceiling, disembodied and ghostly. "But she isn't. And as long as I'm standing, she'll never have to know men like you." Michael saw his opening. Vane had stepped over the spilled kerosene. Michael reached into his pocket and found a single strike-anywhere match, the one he had kept for his pipe but never used. He struck it against the iron beam. The tiny flame flared to life. "For Montana," Michael whispered. He dropped the match. As it hit the floor, a wall of orange fire erupted between Michael and Vane. The heat was instantaneous, a roaring wall of gold that mirrored the sunset Michael had promised the girl. In the confusion of the flames, Michael dropped from the rafters like a falling stone. He landed directly in front of Emily's hiding spot. He didn't look at Vane. He didn't look at the fire. He scooped Emily up in one arm, her small hands locking around his neck in a grip of pure trust. "Close your eyes, kiddo," Michael said, his voice a soothing contrast to the roar of the inferno. "We're going for a ride." He didn't head for the doors. He headed for the loading crane, the one that hung over the black, freezing waters of the lake. The heat at Michael's back was no longer a warmth. It was a hungry beast. The warehouse was breathing fire, the ancient timber groaning under the weight of the inferno. Below them, the black water of the Chicago River churned with ice, a dark abyss that promised a different kind of death. Michael stood on the edge of the loading bay, the wind whipping his coat like the wings of a fallen angel. Emily was tucked against his chest, her face buried in the crook of his neck. "Michael?" Her voice was small, muffled by the roar of the flames. "Is the wooden bird okay?" Michael looked down at his empty hand, then back at the fire where Vane stood, screaming in the orange haze. "The bird is flying, Emily. He's already where we're going." Before Michael could leap, a shadow detached itself from the smoke. Silas Vane staggered onto the loading dock, his charcoal coat singed, his face a mask of blistered skin and pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't have his revolver anymore. It had been lost in the kerosene fire. But he held a long, jagged piece of glass in his shaking hand. "You don't get to leave, Michael," Vane shrieked, the sound barely human. "If I burn, the legend of the hammer burns with me." Vane lunged. He wasn't a fighter, but he had the desperation of a cornered rat. Michael stepped back, his heel hanging over the edge of the abyss. He couldn't fight Vane, not while holding Emily. She was his heart, and a man cannot fight while protecting his heart with both hands. "Elias," Michael roared, looking toward the far end of the dock. From the shadows of the neighboring warehouse, a figure emerged. It was the doctor, shivering in the cold, holding a heavy iron lantern. He hadn't stayed at the clinic. He had followed the smoke. The secret word, "Elias!" Michael yelled. "Montana!" Elias shouted back, his voice cracked with fear. Michael looked down at Emily. "Go to the doctor, kiddo. Run like the wind." Michael set Emily down and pushed her toward Elias. For a second she hesitated, her small hand reaching back for his. "Go," Michael commanded. It was the first time he had ever used his hammer voice with her, the voice that broke men. She ran. As Elias scooped her up and disappeared into the safety of the dark alleyway, Michael turned back to Vane. The weight was gone. The heart was safe. Now, there was only the monster left to deal with the monster. Vane swung the glass shard, slicing through the air. Michael didn't dodge. He stepped into the blow, letting the glass tear through his shoulder. He needed to be close. He grabbed Vane by the lapels of his expensive coat, his fingers locking like iron clamps. "You wanted the hammer, Silas?" Michael whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying calm. "You got him." The floorboards beneath them gave way. The fire had eaten the supports, and the wood finally surrendered. Michael didn't struggle. He didn't try to grab the ledge. He held Vane tight, pulling him into the fall. They tumbled through the freezing air, a falling star of fire and shadow, hitting the ice-choked water with a sound like a thunderclap. The cold was absolute. It rushed into Michael's lungs, turning his blood to slush. He felt Vane's grip slacken as the shock of the water took the life from the smaller man. Michael let go. He watched Vane sink into the blackness, the fine wool coat fluttering like the wings of a drowned crow. Michael fought to the surface, his limbs heavy as lead. He grabbed a floating timber, gasping for air that felt like needles. He looked up at the dock, high above, silhouetted against the orange glow of the dying warehouse. He saw a small figure, Emily. She was standing at the edge of the alley, Elias holding her back. She wasn't crying. She was watching the water. Michael raised a shaking, frozen hand. He couldn't speak, but he saw her nod. She knew. He let the current take him. He didn't head for the docks where the police were gathering. He headed for the South Bank, the long, dark path that led away from the city, away from the blood, and toward the open sky. The air here didn't taste like soot or salt. It tasted of pine needles, cold mountain runoff, and infinite possibility. In the high country of Montana, the shadows didn't hunt you. They only offered a place to rest when the sun grew too bright. A young woman stood on the porch of a small, sturdy cabin overlooking a valley that glowed like hammered gold in the evening light. She walked with a slight, rhythmic hitch in her step, a reminder of a frozen night a lifetime ago. But she moved with a grace that spoke of strength, not fragility. In her hand, she held a small, weathered piece of wood. It was a bird, its wings smoothed by over a decade of touch. "Emily!" A voice called from inside. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his hair now white as the mountain peaks, but his eyes still sharp behind his spectacles. He held a rolled parchment tied with a blue ribbon. "The post came from the city," Elias said, handing her the tube. "It's official. Dr. Emily Dawson, the first woman from this territory to head back east for her residency at the University Hospital." Emily took the parchment, her eyes glistening. He would have liked the title, wouldn't he? He would have said titles don't matter as much as the hands that hold them. Elias smiled. But yes, he would have been insufferably proud. Emily looked toward the edge of the property, where the tall grass met the tree line. There, a man was working. He was older now, his back slightly bent from years of honest labor on the ranch, and his hair was more silver than brown. He moved slowly, his left shoulder stiff, a permanent souvenir from a night of fire and glass. He was hammering a fence post into the ground. Each strike was steady, rhythmic, and purposeful. The hammer was no longer a name of fear. It was the tool of a builder. Michael stopped and wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana. He looked toward the cabin and saw Emily standing there with her diploma. He didn't wave, and he didn't shout. He simply took off his hat and held it against his heart for a long moment. In that silence, 1,000 words were spoken. The debt wasn't just paid, it had been transformed into a legacy. The outlaw who had once broken lives had spent the last decade building a world where a little girl didn't just survive, she thrived. Emily walked down the porch steps and headed toward the small garden where a single rose bush struggled against the mountain cold, a gift from Michael on her 16th birthday. Beneath its roots, buried deep in the soil, sat a small, rusted iron pipe and a nickel-plated coin. They were relics of a dead man, left in the earth so the living could keep walking. She looked up as a real hawk circled in the thermal vents above the valley. It screamed once, a wild, free sound that echoed off the cliffs. "We made it, Michael," she whispered to the wind. "We made it to Montana." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the exact same shade of orange as the fire. in the warehouse. But this time, there was no smoke. There was no fear. There was only the quiet, steady sound of a hammer hitting wood, building a home that would last forever.